6 hours. That's how long I had owned my lake house before my father decided it was already his. Not a room in it, not a favor, all of it. The phone rang before I'd even unpacked a single box, and by the end of that call, my parents had already picked which bedroom they wanted, already told a moving company to load a truck, and already sent a stranger to appraise my new home for something they were calling an investment. A man I had never spoken to in my life was asking permission to walk through my house and put a number on it, because my father had promised him a piece of it that was never his to give. That's the part that still catches me off guard when I think back on it. It wasn't that my parents wanted to move in. Families do that. It's that my father had been quietly offering 40% of a house he didn't own to people I'd never met, months before I even signed the papers. He didn't ask me. He didn't warn me. He simply assumed that once he showed up with a truck and a folder full of documents, I would fold the way I always had. For years, I did fold. I paid their bills when they fell behind. I covered emergency repairs. I loaned money that turned into gifts nobody ever intended to repay. And every single time, I told myself that was just what family does. But the night before they arrived with that moving truck, something in me finally went still and quiet in a way it never had before. I didn't cry. I didn't call to argue. I opened my laptop instead, made a few phone calls nobody expected me to make, and started putting together something my father would open the next morning at what he thought was going to be his housewarming lunch. I wrapped it in a silver ribbon and set it right in the middle of the table. He had no idea what was waiting for him inside those envelopes or how quickly his moving truck was going to end up driving straight back to a house he'd already told everyone was sold. Watching from where? Please comment. My name is Emily Carter, and at 27, I had owned my dream lake house for exactly 6 hours before my father decided it belonged to him too. I'd spent 7 years working extra shifts, turning down vacations, and slowly rebuilding my savings after bailing my family out of one crisis after another. This house was supposed to be the one thing in my life that nobody else could lay claim to. Then my phone rang. "Beautiful place," my father said, skipping straight past any congratulations. "We sold our house, so we're moving in tomorrow." Before I could respond, my mother grabbed the phone from him. "We need the main bedroom. If that's a problem for you, don't be there." I stood there surrounded by boxes I hadn't even unpacked yet. They weren't asking to stay with me for a while. They had already picked their bedroom, already booked a moving truck, and already decided that the home I'd bought with my own money was theirs to walk into. Part of me wanted to scream, to remind them of every broken promise and every dollar they still owed me. Instead, I asked, "What time should I expect you?" My father sounded satisfied. 9 in the morning. Have the gate open." The second the call ended, another notification popped up on my screen. A financial consultant I had never met was requesting permission to appraise my lake house on my father's behalf. That's when it hit me. The move wasn't the real plan. It was only step one. They didn't just want a place to live. They wanted the property itself. What do you do when the people who raised you to be obedient start treating that obedience like ownership? I didn't argue with them that night. I opened my laptop, made 4 phone calls, and got to work preparing a welcome gift they would never forget. The appraisal request had come from a man named Gregory Sanders. His email referred to my property as the Carter family's second home and asked when someone could come inspect it for a proposed investment deal. I called him right away. Gregory sounded genuinely confused when I told him I was the sole owner. He explained that my father, Richard Carter, had spent the last 3 months raising money for a luxury cabin development near the lake. Richard had told Gregory and another investor that he'd use the proceeds from selling his own house to fund part of it and secure the rest using a partial stake in my property. According to Richard, I had already agreed to hand over 40% of the lake house once he moved in. I asked Gregory to forward me every document with my name on it. 10 minutes later, my inbox held a full presentation, photos pulled straight from my real estate listing, an estimated property value, and a line describing me as a silent family partner. My father hadn't just invited himself into my home. He'd been promising pieces of it to people I'd never even met. The shock should have been bigger than it was, but it fit a pattern I had spent years refusing to name. When I landed my first full-time job, Richard convinced me to deposit my paychecks into a family account, insisting I was too inexperienced to handle money on my own. When I tried moving out at 22, my mother, Patricia, told relatives I was abandoning them during a financial emergency. I stayed another year and paid their overdue property taxes. At 24, Richard borrowed money for what he called a temporary business opportunity. He signed a repayment agreement, made 2 payments, and then acted wounded whenever I brought up the rest. By the time I finally separated my finances from theirs, they owed me $64,200. They called it family support. My bank statements called it something else. For years, I protected their reputation because exposing them felt disloyal. That silence had taught them the wrong lesson. It convinced them there would never be a price to pay. I called Rachel Simmons, the attorney who'd handled my lake house purchase. Once I explained the situation, she told me not to let a single box across the threshold and not to sign a thing. I forwarded her the investment presentation, the appraisal request, my title documents, and Richard's old repayment agreement. Then I asked Gregory whether he and his business partner would come to a housewarming lunch the next day. I told him Richard deserved the chance to explain his plan with everyone involved in the room. Gregory agreed. My next call was about my parents' house. Richard had claimed it was already sold, but the public listing showed it was only under contract, with closing still 11 days out. 2 years earlier, I had paid for emergency repairs after water kept pushing against a damaged retaining wall behind that house. Richard had refused to pay for the full fix because it was expensive. I still had the contractor's report, the photos, the invoices, and an email where Richard had written, "We'll deal with the wall after we sell. No reason to scare off a buyer now." Rachel reached out to the buyer's attorney and handed over the documents. We didn't exaggerate a single thing. We simply gave the buyer information my parents had chosen to hide. My last call went to the moving company. I explained that I owned the destination property and hadn't authorized anything to be unloaded. The dispatcher said the crew could still show up, but without my sign-off, they'd either have to wait, turn around, or place everything in paid storage under my parents' contract, and any charges would land on Richard and Patricia. By midnight, everything was ready. I placed 4 envelopes inside a polished wooden box and tied it with a silver ribbon. One was about their house. One was about Richard's investment project. One was about the money they owed me. The last one held the only set of keys I planned on handing them. I set the box in the middle of the dining table and went to bed. I wasn't asking myself anymore how to get my parents to respect me. I was deciding how much truth they could handle in one sitting. At 8:57 the next morning, a moving truck pulled up outside my gate. Richard's car followed close behind, packed so full that garment bags blocked the back windows. Patricia stepped out holding a folder, a handbag, and the expression of someone checking into a hotel she'd already decided to complain about. Richard didn't say hello. He pointed toward the house and told the movers to carry the largest bedroom set upstairs. I stood by the locked front door and told the crew that no furniture had been cleared to go inside. The supervisor checked his tablet, glanced at Richard, and said he'd need the property owner's permission. "I'm her father," Richard said. "We're moving into our family home." "The property owner is standing right next to you," I said. Richard's jaw tightened. Patricia peered through the windows and announced the living room furniture would need replacing because my taste was too modern. She'd been on the property for under 2 minutes. I asked why a consultant had requested an appraisal. Something flickered across his face for just a second. "That's part of the family plan," he said. "Once we're settled, we'll talk through some paperwork. You'll benefit too." Patricia put a hand on my arm and used the gentle voice she reserved for whenever manipulation needed to sound like concern. She said the cabin project could bring long-term security for all of us, and that transferring a small portion of the property was fair after everything they'd done for me. "How small?" I asked. Richard opened the folder Patricia had carried. Inside was an occupancy agreement, a proposed deed transfer, and paperwork authorizing him to talk to lenders about my property. He'd already flagged the signature lines in bright yellow. He said we could finish everything after lunch. I nodded like the papers had surprised me less than they actually had. "Lunch is ready," I said, "but we should talk first." My calm unsettled them. They'd braced for resistance, tears, or an argument they could brush off as emotional. Cooperation wasn't something they'd prepared for. I walked them around to the covered deck, where the table was already set for 5. The wooden welcome box sat right in the center. Richard noticed the extra place settings. Before he could ask, another car pulled up to the gate. Gregory arrived with his business partner, Diane Foster. Richard's face went pale. He'd told them they were investors, but their expressions made it obvious they hadn't come to celebrate anything. Rachel arrived right after, a slim briefcase in hand. I introduced her as my attorney. Patricia's grip tightened on her folder. "Why is a lawyer at a family lunch?" she asked. "Because Dad showed up with property transfer paperwork before we even had coffee," I said. "I figured everyone deserved proper advice." Richard tried to recover, laughing it off to Gregory, saying I was just cautious since the house was new. Gregory didn't laugh. He asked flatly whether the lake house belonged entirely to me. Richard answered before I could. "Temporarily, yes. Emily understands family assets should stay in the family." Diane looked straight at me. "Have you agreed to use this property as collateral?" "No," I said. That one word cut straight through whatever performance Richard had been running. He immediately insisted we'd discussed it many times. I asked him to point to a single conversation, email, or signed paper where I'd agreed. He couldn't. Patricia accused me of stirring up tension when they'd just arrived. I reminded her they'd arrived with a moving truck and paperwork built to transfer ownership. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a plan already in motion. Outside, the movers were still waiting, and the clock on their charges had already started running. Richard's phone buzzed with the first alert, but he ignored it, still convinced he could steer things back his way once everyone sat down. He straightened his jacket and said reasonable adults could sort this out over food. I agreed. The lunch gave him a stage, and I wanted him confident enough to say every lie out loud before I took it all away. Richard spent the first course acting like he was running a business meeting. He complimented my cooking, talked up the cabin project's potential, and referred to the lake house like my ownership was just a paperwork detail waiting to be corrected. Patricia backed him up with talk of legacy, retirement, and keeping valuable property in the family. Neither one asked if I actually wanted them there. Neither one mentioned that they'd claimed their own house was sold before ever telling me. Their whole argument rested on one belief. Because they were my parents, my no could never really be final. When Gregory asked how Richard planned to cover the required capital, Richard said the proceeds from his house sale would fund the first phase, and the lake house would secure the rest of the financing. He slid the transfer papers next to my plate along with a pen. "We should just finalize this while everyone's here," he said. I didn't touch the pen. Instead, I asked why the investment presentation called me a silent partner. He said it was just convenient wording used during early talks. I asked why the asset list gave him 40% of my house. He claimed that percentage reflected the value of his guidance throughout my life. Diane stopped taking notes and stared at him. "Your guidance has a property value attached to it?" I asked. "Don't twist my words," he snapped. "You wouldn't be where you are without us." That was the sentence I'd been waiting for. I turned on the screen mounted near the table. The first document was the closing statement from my purchase, a price of $486,000, a down payment of $121,500, and a mortgage in my name alone. The next pages traced every dollar in that transaction back to my salary, my savings, and my investment account. Richard and Patricia hadn't put in a cent. Richard waved it off as a technicality. I switched screens again. A spreadsheet listed everything I'd covered for them over the past 6 years. Property taxes, insurance, emergency repairs, business transfers, and the unpaid loan. Every line had a bank record, invoice, or signed acknowledgement attached. The total came to $64,200. Patricia said keeping records of family help was cold and unnatural. "You kept records when you thought I owed you gratitude," I said. "I kept records when you owed me money." Richard accused me of humiliating them in front of everyone. Gregory pointed out that he'd brought investors into a deal based on ownership he never actually had. Richard insisted the transfer would still happen once I stopped overreacting. Rachel finally spoke up. She explained that no interest in the property could transfer without my direct, voluntary agreement, and that no lender could rely on promises Richard had made about an asset that wasn't his. She also confirmed the appraisal request had never been authorized. Gregory asked Richard whether he'd ever shown him a signed commitment from me. Richard admitted he hadn't, but argued a parent shouldn't need formal permission from someone who'd benefited from years of family support. How many lies can someone dress up as love before love turns into leverage? I looked at the man who'd spent my whole life teaching me to apologize the moment I pushed back. For the first time, I understood that his authority had only ever survived because everyone around him mistook confidence for proof. Diane closed the investment folder and told Richard their agreement required honest representations and that what he'd claimed about the lake house was materially false. Richard's tone hardened. He said the project would go on and that I'd sign once we talked privately. "There won't be a private conversation," I said. Patricia tried to smooth things over, telling Gregory and Diane that I was just overwhelmed by moving day and would calm down once they settled in. "You are not settling into this house," I said. The table went quiet. Patricia looked at me like I'd broken some rule that existed before I was even born. Richard called me an ungrateful child. I reminded him that children didn't buy $500,000 homes, bail their parents out of financial emergencies, or get used as collateral for someone else's business promises. He slid the pen toward me again. "Just sign the occupancy agreement. We can sort out the percentage later." I picked up the pen, and instead of signing, I drew a line through every single signature tab. Then, across the top of the first page, I wrote, "Owner does not consent." I dated it and handed it to Rachel. Richard's face went red. Patricia muttered that I was destroying the family over a house. "No," I said. "You're risking the family because you decided my house was easier to take than your own responsibility." Richard started gathering his papers, telling Gregory they'd reschedule after he dealt with me. Gregory said there'd be no rescheduling. Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed again and again. One message about his house, one from the moving company, one from the account holding the investors' money. I reached for the silver ribbon on the box. "You came here expecting a welcome gift," I said. "It's time to open it." Patricia pulled the box toward herself, maybe hoping it was some kind of peace offering that would let everyone forget the last 20 minutes. Richard told her not to touch it, but I untied the ribbon myself and set 4 envelopes in front of him. Each one had a single word written on it. The first said, "Home." Inside was the notice their buyer's attorney had sent that morning. The buyers were pulling out after learning about a property condition that had never been disclosed. Attached were the contractor's report, photos of the damaged retaining wall, the invoices proving my parents had known about it, and Richard's own email saying not to mention it until after closing. Their house had never actually sold. It had only been under contract, and that contract was now falling apart. Richard read the page twice. Patricia insisted buyers couldn't just change their minds after making an offer. Rachel explained that the undisclosed issue raised serious concerns, and the buyers had already told their lender and closing agent to halt everything. The profit Richard had promised his investors no longer existed. He accused me of sabotaging the sale. "I gave the buyer accurate information," I said. "The truth only sabotages deals that were built on lies." His phone rang, his real estate agent's name on the screen, and he sent it to voicemail. I slid the second envelope toward him. It said, "Business." Inside was a letter from Gregory and Diane's company pulling out of the cabin project and demanding a full accounting of the $120,000 they'd already advanced. Richard had presented my lake house as available collateral and had repeatedly called me a committed partner. Since none of that was true, no more funding would be released, and their attorney would be reviewing everything already spent. Richard had used part of that advance to lock in a non-refundable land option, produce marketing materials, and host an investor event. Without the rest of the money, the project was dead, and what had already gone out wouldn't just come back on its own. Gregory told him trust had been the most valuable thing in that deal, and Richard had wrecked it. Richard argued the transfer was only delayed. "It's not delayed," I said. "It was never agreed to in the first place." Diane asked why he'd scheduled an appraisal before he even had my consent. Richard said experienced business people sometimes had to move faster than cautious relatives. Gregory stood up and told him that calling fraud speed didn't make it a strategy. He and Diane left without finishing lunch. Watching their car pull through the gate felt more final than any argument could have. The third envelope said, "Debt." Richard opened it slowly. Inside was a formal demand Rachel had drafted for the $64,200, backed by bank records, invoices, and his own signed repayment agreement. It gave him a deadline to propose repayment before we filed a civil claim. For years I'd told myself that enforcing that agreement would make me the cruel one. Richard had counted on that guilt, treating my reluctance to hurt him as permission to keep taking. Patricia said they'd raised me, fed me, and paid for countless things while I was growing up. Raising me wasn't something you did alone, I said, and it doesn't give you permanent access to my paycheck. She insisted some of it had been gifts. Rachel pointed to a message where Richard had written, "Once the house sells, Emily gets every dollar back." His own words, sitting right next to the notice explaining the sale, had just fallen through. The last envelope said, "Keys." Richard opened it and found the spare keys to his own house, the one he and Patricia still legally owned, now sitting empty while their furniture waited outside my gate. Underneath the keys was a copy of the moving contract. Since I'd refused to authorize unloading, the crew would either haul everything back to their old address or move it into storage, with Richard and Patricia covering the waiting time, mileage, labor, and storage fees. The supervisor estimated it would cost close to $4,800 just to return everything, and every extra hour of arguing would push that number higher. "That's your welcome gift," I said. "A documented trip back to the life you tried to walk away from by taking mine." Richard shot up so fast his chair hit the deck railing. He said I'd planned this lunch to ruin him. I reminded him that he was the one who'd shown up with a moving truck, tried to occupy my home, pushed for my signature, and used my property to bail out his own failing deal. My plan hadn't caused his problems. It had just stopped hiding them. Patricia started crying, but only about what relatives would think, how humiliating the returned truck would look, and how they'd explain the collapsed sale. She never once apologized for telling me to leave my own house, and never asked what would have happened if I'd actually signed. Richard grabbed the envelopes and told Patricia to start carrying their suitcases inside while he handled the movers. "No," I said. He stared at me. "We have nowhere else set up. You have a house. It's empty. Your furniture is 30 yards away." He pointed at the front door and said he was going in whether I liked it or not. That's when Rachel opened her briefcase and pulled out the document I'd hoped we wouldn't need. She handed Richard written notice that his permission to enter or remain on the property had been revoked. He had no lease, no ownership interest, no established residence there, and no authorization to bring anything inside. 2 security officers I'd hired were already waiting near the gate, staying out of sight because I hadn't wanted a public scene. Richard looked from Rachel to the officers and accused me of treating him like a criminal. "I'm treating you like someone who threatened to force his way into my home after being told no," I said. He picked up a suitcase and started toward the steps. The officer stepped forward, but I raised a hand and gave him one last chance. "Put it down. Call the movers. Go home." He asked if I really intended to choose a house over my own parents. That question had controlled me for years because it made every boundary sound like betrayal. Standing there, I finally saw through it. He hadn't asked me to choose between him and a house. He'd chosen access to my property over any kind of respectful relationship with me. "You made your choice the moment you promised my home to strangers," I said. Patricia begged him to stop, not out of any respect for what I'd decided, but because the small audience gathering around us frightened her. The movers had paused near the truck. The officers were watching. Rachel was documenting everything. Richard set the suitcase down, but kept threatening me anyway, saying he'd tell the whole family I'd abandoned them after forcing them to sell their house. I unlocked my phone and opened a family video call I'd scheduled for noon. 6 faces appeared, including Aunt Margaret, 2 uncles, and other relatives who'd spent weeks congratulating Richard on his supposed retirement at the lake. He'd told them all that I'd begged my parents to move in because I couldn't handle the property alone. I set the phone on a stand where everyone could see the table. Richard demanded I end the call. I didn't. Margaret asked why there was a moving truck outside. I laid it all out. The appraisal request, the false ownership claims, the collapsed house sale, the investment presentation, showing the actual pages, no commentary needed. Margaret went quiet when she saw the amount Richard owed me. Then she asked if his cabin project was the same opportunity he'd borrowed $25,000 from her for. Richard said that was private. She said it stopped being private the moment he used the same false property claim on multiple people. One uncle admitted Richard had asked him for money too, using the lake house as the guarantee. The story Richard had been telling the family started falling apart in real time. Patricia tried to steer things by insisting they'd only planned to live with me temporarily while their sale closed. I reminded her she'd demanded the main bedroom and told me to leave my own house if that bothered me. Margaret asked if that was true. Patricia hesitated, then said she'd just been stressed and hadn't meant it literally. "You showed up with a moving truck," I said. "You had a deed transfer ready to sign. Which part of that wasn't literal?" Richard told the group that parents had a moral claim to the success of the children they raised. Someone asked if that claim included using someone's property without permission. Another asked why he'd hidden the retaining wall problem. For the first time, nobody rushed to calm him down or tell me to apologize. They had the documents right in front of them. His anger couldn't rearrange anything anymore. Margaret told him she expected a repayment plan by the end of the week. My uncle said he wasn't putting another dollar into anything Richard touched. A cousin who'd signed on for the cabin project backed out on the spot. Richard ended the call from my own phone, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. The people whose opinions he actually cared about had just watched his authority fall apart in real time. He turned on Patricia and demanded to know why she'd let me call everyone. That's when Patricia finally cracked. She said they wouldn't have needed investors at all if Richard had just admitted his last business had failed. She admitted they'd planned to move in with me because they couldn't afford both their mortgage and the cabin project. She admitted Richard believed living under my roof would make it easier to pressure me into signing over a share of the house. Her confession seemed to shock him more than anything I'd shown that morning. He accused her of betraying him. She said he was the one who'd promised the house sale was guaranteed and that I'd just go along with everything. Whatever united front they'd had disappeared right there. Their whole partnership had rested on each of them believing the other one could control me. Once that belief broke, they turned on each other instead. I didn't feel triumphant watching it happen. I felt clear. Triumph needs someone else's suffering. Clarity just comes from realizing their chaos isn't yours to hold anymore. The moving supervisor came over and asked what we were doing. Richard told him to put everything in storage, since going back home would be humiliating. Patricia balked once she heard the deposit and daily rate. They argued back and forth until the supervisor reminded them the waiting fees were still climbing. Eventually, Patricia decided to just send everything back to their house. Richard had spent the morning picturing himself taking over my lake house. By afternoon, he was paying thousands of dollars to move his own furniture back into a house he'd told everyone was already sold. Before he left, he told me I'd regret humiliating him. Rachel said any further communication about the debt or the property should go through her office instead. Patricia asked where they were even supposed to sleep that night. "In your own bedroom," I said, once the movers put everything back. She looked at me like guilt might reopen a door that had already closed. It didn't. Richard got in the car without a word. Patricia followed. The moving truck turned around behind them. I watched both vehicles disappear past the gate, then went inside and changed the access code. The lock clicking shut was quiet, but it sounded like the end of something I'd been trying to finish for years. The consequences didn't stop once my parents got home. Without their original buyer, they had to relist the house and disclose the retaining wall issue up front. The repair estimate dragged the value down significantly. Their agent dropped them once she learned Richard had hidden the problem in the first place. A new buyer eventually offered $92,000 less than Richard had counted on, and closing took 4 more months. During that stretch, my parents were stuck covering the mortgage, insurance, utilities, moving costs, legal consultations, and part of the repairs themselves. The cabin project fell apart within a week. Gregory and Diane's company demanded the return of whatever funds hadn't been spent, along with a full accounting of everything Richard had used. The land option expired once he couldn't make the next payment. The marketing company kept its fees. Several other potential investors backed out the moment they heard the lake house was never really his to offer. Nothing dramatic or public tore down his reputation. His own presentation did that on its own. Copies with my name, my property photos, and his false promises made the rounds among the people he'd approached. A local business committee removed him after members started questioning his judgment. Friends who used to praise his ambition stopped picking up once they realized he might ask for money. Margaret went after her own loan separately. Other relatives compared notes and realized Richard had told each of them a different version of the same story. To one person, the lake house was already his. To another, I'd offered it freely. To another, he'd secretly paid my down payment himself. Every version worked fine on its own. Once the family put them side by side, none of them held up. Rachel filed a civil claim over the $64,200 after Richard let the deadline pass. He threatened to fight every cent, but his own signatures, emails, and payment history didn't leave him much room. We eventually settled, with repayment coming out of the house sale proceeds along with part of my legal costs. When that money finally landed in my account, I didn't go out and celebrate. I printed the confirmation and slid it into the wooden welcome box. That money wasn't just a number recovered. It was the first time my father had actually been forced to follow through on a promise he'd assumed family pressure would let him wriggle out of. After the house eventually sold, my parents moved into a modest rented duplex outside of town. It was clean and perfectly livable, but it wasn't the image Richard had spent years trying to maintain. Patricia complained that I'd reduced them to renters. Margaret reminded her they'd nearly reduced me to a guest in my own house. The family didn't cut them off completely, but it stopped bailing them out. Invitations stayed polite. Financial help disappeared. When Richard tried to steer conversations his usual way, people started asking direct questions instead of just going along with him. Losing the money hurt him. Losing unquestioned authority hurt more. Patricia sent me several messages over the following month. Some blamed Richard. Others blamed stress, the failed sale, the investors, or my attorney. None of them owned her part in it. I answered once, "Reach out when you can apologize without explaining why your situation made my consent unnecessary." She didn't reply for weeks. When she finally wrote back, the letter was longer and quieter. She admitted she'd treated my independence like rejection because controlling my choices had always made her feel secure. She admitted telling me to leave my own house had been cruel. I read the letter, but I didn't invite her over. Understanding isn't the same thing as restored trust. An apology can open a door, but it doesn't earn you a key. Richard never gave a full apology. His first message said he was sorry things had gotten so public. His second said I'd made my point and should help them rebuild. His third warned that people who humiliate family usually end up alone. I forwarded every one of them to Rachel and didn't respond. Silence used to be how I absorbed being mistreated. Now it's how I refuse to participate. 6 months after moving into the lake house, I turned the unused guest room into a studio and office, the same room Patricia had claimed for herself before she ever set foot inside. I filled it with shelves, a work table, and framed copies of the paperwork that had protected me. The title showing sole ownership, the debt settlement, and confirmation that the appraisal had never been authorized. I didn't put them up to stay angry. I put them up because memory has a way of turning generous after a crisis fades. Time softens voices. It turns threats into misunderstandings and calculated plans into mistakes. Those documents remind me that if forgiveness ever comes, it can't come with forgetting attached. People sometimes ask if I regret exposing my parents instead of handling it privately. The truth is, privacy was exactly what they depended on. It let Richard tell investors one story, relatives another, and me a third. It let Patricia make cruel demands and later call them emotional accidents. Bringing everything into the same room wasn't unnecessary humiliation. It was the only way to stop them from rewriting the story, depending on who was listening. My revenge was never about taking their house, wrecking their finances, or inventing some kind of punishment. I didn't create the damaged wall, the dishonest investment presentation, the unpaid debts, or the moving charges. I just stopped letting my money, my property, my reputation, and my silence act as a cushion between them and the consequences of their own choices. They paid a steep price because they'd built their whole plan on the assumption that I would fold. The wooden welcome box still sits on a shelf by my front door. These days, it only holds the settlement confirmation. Every time I see it, I remember the morning my father showed up believing my home was his next asset and my life was his next negotiation. He left with the keys to a house he'd tried to abandon, a truck full of furniture he couldn't unload, and 4 envelopes full of the truth. The lake house stayed mine. More importantly, so did every decision that came after it. Some families call obedience love, because love sounds kinder than control. But when someone demands that you give up your safety, your future, or your dignity just to prove you care, What are they really asking you to protect? The relationship, or their power over you? Thank you for watching until the very end. This story is completely fictional, created only for entertainment, reflection, and conversation. We hope it's a reminder that choosing peace sometimes means disappointing people who expected you to keep absorbing the chaos, and that disappointment doesn't mean you were wrong.